I am very excited to talk with Kurt Weingarten. Kurt received his PhD in electrical engineering at Stanford University. He founded Time Bandwidth Products in Zurich in Switzerland in the mid-90s to develop simple, robust, ultra-fast lasers for scientific and industrial applications. Lumentum acquired Time Bandwidth Products in 2014. I look forward to discuss and share with you more about Kurt's career, ambitions, challenges, and lessons learned. So it's a pleasure for me to be able to talk with Kurt Weingarten. I've been knowing him for a couple of years. He's been partly my boss. He was on the EPIC board of directors, and I've been very blessed to have actually, because he could bring to EPIC, and also I have learned a lot from him because of the entrepreneurial side, how to grow a company, how do we grow an association. So I've been very blessed to be able to work with Kurt, and also through this video recording to be able to share it with the whole world, so that entrepreneurs, young people, everybody can just learn from each other, have some food for thoughts, and be inspired. So thank you very much for having this talk. There is a new wave of entrepreneurs coming up. Most of the people I work with, they are in the 45, 60s. They started, when there was not yet an industry. There's a whole new wave of entrepreneurs starting. Ambitious, they want to achieve things. And I think there's a lot that they could learn from you because you've done all the way through. So I'd like to learn a bit more about that. We can share that with them. And so maybe you can start by telling us a bit about the early beginnings. How did you even get into photonics? And was it even called photonics at the time?
Yeah, it definitely wasn't called photonics at the time. That's actually good. I liked lasers. I thought lasers were cool. And when I decided to go to graduate school, I grew up in the South and went to school at Georgia Tech, and then decided I wanted to go out west. And Stanford had a good lasers program. So that's what drove me to Stanford. And after, I would say I caught the entrepreneurial bug. I definitely caught it at Stanford, right? It was just in the air. I mean, this was also the mid 80s. It was relatively normal for people to think about startup companies. So my professor was involved in startup companies. There was people around me that were involved in startup companies. It wasn't at the level that we have now. It's even more in California. But it was really just part of the environment. So
you're from the US, your family's from the US?
Yes, I grew up in Florida, right? And then decided after I spent 18 years in Florida and then 4 years in Georgia that I needed to get the hell out of the South, and I went to California.
And your parents, engineer, entrepreneurs?
No, not at all. My mom is a housewife and my dad is a pharmacist. So I have no idea why I have a technical streak. They don't understand what I do. They think it's boring. I don't know where it came from.
And Stanford was already famous at the time.
Yes, it was relatively, but remember we didn't have internet. I had never heard of Stanford back then, but I went to one of my professors, or a couple of my professors at Georgia Tech, and I said, hey, where should I go to graduate school if I like lasers? And one of them was actually a Stanford alumni, and he recommended me to his professor at Stanford, and that got me in as a research assistant, and kind of got the ball rolling. But I applied to also USC down in LA and also Berkeley, and I had a chance to go out and visit all three. The other criteria was Stanford was by far the most beautiful campus, and they also had a good male-female ratio, and all of those things were somehow part of the equation of saying, yeah, that's probably a good place to hang out for the next 4 or 5 years.
Maybe we'll find out how the male-female ratio had an impact in your life.
Yes, right, yeah.
You mentioned the word laser. Was that the word that you had at the time? Was it how it was called back then?
Yes, lasers. The other thing I loved as a young kid, and I did a project on it as an undergrad, was laser fusion. Right? I thought Lawrence Livermore, laser fusion, that was super cool. And the prediction at the time was it would be 20 to 30 years until we had working laser fusion systems. Of course, it's still 20 or 30 or 40 years predicted until we have working economical laser fusion systems, but still it kind of awoke the interest in lasers.
And lasers, there wasn't, I'm just new in this industry, but was it already an industry lasers, or was it more like a technology or a science? What was the status of the industry at that time?
There were definitely companies making lasers. I mean, of course, the ones that were well known at the time were spectrophysics and coherent, right? So when I was a graduate student at Stanford and we needed a laser, there was 2 companies that made the lasers we needed, spectrophysics and coherent, right? And so we would go to them and compare quotes and specs and then make a decision and build that into our research proposal, right? If we had to buy one. Yeah.
And after the studies, did you then go and work at a company, or you continued studying a bit more?
No, so I definitely decided I wanted to pursue a commercial route, and I looked at actually a number of startup companies. I also decided I didn't want to go. I mean, I definitely didn't want to go the professorial or academic route. I also had a chance to at least consider good places like IBM Research Labs or Bell Labs at the time, but I was not super attracted to that either. And so I actually interviewed with a bunch of startup companies on the West Coast, mostly in the Bay Area, but even as far up as Portland, Oregon. And I ended up going to the one that my professor was a co-founder of. It was called Lightwave Electronics. And I continued I was actually trying to commercialize my PhD project. And at the time, it was mostly funded by government projects, SBIRs, as they were called at the time, Small Business Innovative Research Projects. But that's also where a big part of the company was working on this new technology called diode-pumped solid-state lasers. And I learned a lot about that when I was there and started to focus more and more on making mode-locked diode-pumped solid-state lasers that were easy to use in industrial working. So I was also in the late 80s now.
How much of those career choices, the studies that you did, and then going to the entrepreneurship, were there? How much did it come from inside of you and just following your path, or was it the way to go forward? Because I would assume that entrepreneurship, is that something that was encouraged? My point is, to what extent you listen to what you feel and do versus what you should be doing.
Right. That's a good question. I'm thinking in my case, I think everybody's a little bit different, but it was definitely driven by whatever need for something not quite so boring and well-defined. And again, that was easy in California, right? I mean, that was pretty normal. There was definitely people in our group that wanted to pursue normal careers. And there was a number of people that went on to do very successful startup companies too, right? So we had a guy who was a couple years younger than me, Rob Marsland, who went on to he was one of the founders of New Focus, which was a super successful company in the photonics and telecom space with Milton Chang, our good friend, right? Yes, so it was, Milton and Rob and another PhD student from Bob Byer's group in the same lab, and then a fourth founder. They were the founders of New Focus. So it really was in the air. It was easy to pick up the virus of, starting a company. But a lot of people just weren't interested in that one. In my case, I was single. I definitely didn't want to do something boring. And, in the end, also, maybe this is a good part about the entrepreneurship is what drives people to say they want to be entrepreneurs. I don't know if we really know, but it's partially this independence that you just want to do things your own way. You don't want to have a boss. And and the reality is you figure if you are successful, it's going to be more financially rewarding than just a normal management job in a company. But it really is, I think, more the excitement and the independence that's the ultimate driver, because that there's a reasonable chance you won't be financially successful, right? I mean, that there's still uncertainty and risk involved, right? So it's just that little bit craziness of saying, let's just go for it and see if we can make it happen, right?
So I know that there are different, and we'll get, because you've got in the end, you also have a European American perspective, but and there are differences in entrepreneurship mindset, in Europe and the USA. Was the entrepreneurship mindset different back then than today? Is there differences?
In Europe or in the US?
Well, there are two aspects. One is back then and today, and Europe and US. Do you see different mindsets in entrepreneurship?
I think it's moved closer. So I think the US has gotten more conservative and less entrepreneurial, including California. And Europe has gotten more entrepreneurial, not a lot, but some, and a little bit less conservative. And I think that goes into saying, a young entrepreneur now doesn't have to look very hard to find examples. And so if you're a young European person with an entrepreneurial interest, you figure out pretty quickly what it takes to do that, whereas in the old days, the information flow was much slower, right? You would have to go to the library and I don't know, find a book on it or something, which was not easy to do. Now you can find it all over the web, right? So
that's a good point. Indeed, today you can see all the successful entrepreneurs and the outcomes of all what has happened. So that is, and this is why I'm so happy to have a chance to talk to you, because I think you had a fantastic career and you made it.
Now we're going to backtrack, but when I went to Stanford, right, I like to point out to younger people today, not only did I not really know about it, to find out about Stanford, I had to go to our library and find the brochure on Stanford and then write them a letter or whatever to ask them for an application, and it was all done by mail. There was absolutely no internet or email connection at that time. It was all done by post. And now I look at that and I kind of go, what? You know, it's just like, it's almost unbelievable now that that was the way things worked back then. But it worked. You know?
Yeah, I'm from 1975, and
Yeah.
when I had my first job, I received the files from my predecessor, and it was a whole stack of faxes.
Yeah.
Luckily,
Yeah.
when I started, it was just the beginning of the PCs, and we did that. When I have to travel a lot, I use a GPS, but back then was different.
Exactly.
So indeed, it's today, the young entrepreneurs of today, they can easily find what is going on, what are the opportunities. The access to the information has probably changed
Dramatically, yeah.
But are there more or less entrepreneurs today than in the past?
My quick reaction is more. I don't have any data to prove that one, but I think it's people are just much more aware of it, and it's not considered crazy, particularly in Europe. Like even places like Switzerland, right? You know, when I showed up in '93, people warned me right and left that it's really hard and the mindset's not correct, and if you fail, you'll be shunned for life. And you know, then I just took my American attitude and said, screw it, I don't care. The worst case for me is I just go back to the U.S., right? You know, so that wasn't such a big deal for me, right?
I don't know the statistics if there are more or less entrepreneurs, but I would assume that in photonics, the opportunities for creating companies in terms of applications of photonics must be much larger.
It's broader now, but maybe the competition is higher again too. So of course, you always look back, but I mean, I think that when I did what I did, I'm not sure if we could really reproduce the way we did time bandwidth now. And you know, I don't want to try again either at that point. And not that style, right? But I mean, we really started off by making sophisticated laboratory-style prototypes that we sold to early adopters for a decent amount of money, and that kind of got us bootstrapped and going. And because the stuff we were doing was so good compared to what was available, when people used our lasers, they were like, I never used a laser that was this good before.
So we still have a couple of steps before we get to time bandwidth
jumping around,
that you created in Zurich. So university, and then what?
Yeah, so I went to work at a startup company, Lightwave Electronics, which had the classic 4 or 5 year stock option plan, and I was about employee number 20, and so that was fun. I learned a lot. During this time, I got romantically involved with my wife, Ursula Keller, and we got married in '88. She graduated and then got a job offer from her dream job, which was Bell Labs. So we made the hard decision to split for 2 years, meaning we were going to have a place on each coast, right? I would stay in California and she would have an apartment in New Jersey. And we arranged it with our employers that we could take, we would just work extra and could take longer weekends once a month. And we would usually meet somewhere for a 4-day weekend once a month, or sometimes combining with conferences like, you know, it wasn't Photonics West at the time, it was Clio was the hot conference. So we did that for 2 years, and we said after 2 years, then I have my stock options, and you know, she has her Bell Labs experience, and we'll try to figure out a solution where we can live together. And as we like to point out, some of our friends predicted that we were going to be, you know, quickly divorced, but it didn't turn out to be true. But nonetheless, we went through all of that, and after 2 years, of course, there wasn't a super great solution. And that's a long story, which we don't want to do now, but in the end, she got this pretty incredible job offer from ETH to come back as a Swiss.
So she's Swiss originally.
She's Swiss, and she came from ETH. She did her master's, her diploma at ETH, and got a great job offer to be a tenured professor, right? And you know, we did our analysis and everything. I somewhere have a matrix where we looked at all the pluses and minuses, and it was 10 times better than job offers in the US at the time in terms of startup funding and support and the whole conditions, the whole package. So I was like, well, that's probably not going to be boring. I'm just going to go try it for a while. And by her having a tenured professor position, not only was it an interesting access to technology that I was interested in, but she had a stable job where, you know, if I didn't have a salary for a year or two, it wasn't going to be life-threatening for our family at the time. We also didn't have any kids, right?
You took some risks, you know. You left your home city. You decided to follow your spouse to Zurich.
Right. Without really knowing how to speak German, and it turns out that doesn't even help because you have to learn Swiss German.
You got out of your comfort zone.
Yeah, definitely. I could definitely say that was true. I was not in a total comfort zone.
Knowing, of course, that you have a fallback plan, but still, you know, some people I feel that they don't want to step out But if you want to get some great results, you maybe have
Right.
to do that.
Well, and that was, I mean, maybe a good thing about the entrepreneurship, right? You would normally say, being in Zurich is not an obvious choice to go if you want to do a startup technology company.
What
And
is the reputation of Zurich at the time? I know today. But
it was like Europe, but it was like now, but even more conservative. I think with the rest of Europe too, right? So, again, people would say, yeah, there's a lot of money here, but nobody wants to spend it on risky startup companies. Plus, if you start a company and you fail, you're kind of shunned for life because you're a failure. Whereas, in Silicon Valley, if you haven't failed once or twice, it's like, well, he doesn't have that much experience, And so they really turned lemons into lemonade, right? But I just went in anyway, and there was a movement happening already. There was actually a guy who now has passed away who really was helping to catalyze this, called Thomas von Vodkirch. He started the Technopark in Zurich, and he was a big supporter of startup companies. And so
the Technopark did not exist yet, because when I met you the first time, it was in that Technopark.
Right, so when I showed up in '93, they were just completing it. And when I moved in there a couple of years later, it was still like 1/3 empty or something. And then by the time, of course, we moved out, it was all filled up, and we'd taken almost the whole floor and all that stuff, right? So it definitely, I think, helped catalyze the startup scene in Zurich.
At that time, was the city, like I work a lot with Berlin, and Berlin is really trying to strongly encourage and promote entrepreneurship. Was there a push again from the city or for the people around you, or again from the inside you said, you know what, I want to make a company?
There was like an underground push. I think the city government never really got it right. I mean, it was more of the conservative or, socially focused government, right? They just sort of let it, I mean, they were always business friendly generally. They would just let it happen, right? But they were not super supportive of startup companies. It's kind of more of it's still kind of more of an underground movement in Zurich.
So how did you start Time Bandwidth, and why?
Well, it was super easy to start. I mean, how is it's actually, it turns out it's not difficult to start a company. You just go and register it and pay a little bit of money here and there, and company's there. Then you have to, what do you do? But yeah, I mean, I worked for a year or two as a consultant when I first moved there, and just tried to get my feet on the ground. I actually worked a little bit part-time in Ursi's lab to help her get going and train some of her graduate students and just set things up. And we actually published a couple joint papers back then and did got some nice results. And then I did actually get some support from ETH. They actually had an official spin-off program, and I got a 50,000 Swiss franc loan that I could pay back under easy conditions. And then they also I got a local project. It was called a CTI project, which allowed me to hire 2 engineers and work on my stuff. I didn't pay myself during that time, and we got to use like one office space and part of the lab more or less for free or for very low cost. For like a year or two. And then during that period, we were able to design and build the first prototype lasers, where we made a diode-pumped solid-state mode-lock laser using a CSUM. So it was like the first easy-to-use turnkey laser that was very, very stable. And we made a couple different flavors of those at the beginning, and I basically would go to trade shows like Photonics West. In that case, it was other trade shows, with very simple data sheets and hand them out to my friends and colleagues. And I got a couple of orders from that, basically. Of course, I used my other connections and went out and officially marketed it and stuff too, right?
Okay, then
it was really bootstrapped, right?
Yeah, Bootstrapped created the company.
Right.
Okay.
So at that point then, once we got a couple of real commercial orders going, then, and anyway, it was getting close to that 2-year period, then I moved out to Technopark and took me and my 2 guys, and we started to hire consistently. When we would sell a laser or 2 or 3 and had extra money, we'd go out and hire somebody and just build up from there and just opportunistically try to grow.
How many years did Time Bandwidth start?
Well, so we sold our very first laser in late '96, and we got acquired in 2014. So it was 17 years actually, I would say, plus a few months. So it was definitely not, it's not a venture capital timescale, right? 17 years would not work under a venture capital funding model, right?
In your mindset, when you started the company, what was your time length? How did you envision it? In so many years, I will be there.
I thought 5 or 10 years max. Yeah, I thought, already 5 years was probably like, wow, it's a long time, but that probably ought to be okay. But yeah, maybe it's really going to be 10. So of course, a lot of things happen in the meantime, of course, that you plan or don't plan. We had 2 kids. I had a key guy leave and do a startup company. We had the telecom bubble, and I started another company with venture capital funding. Little details like that all happening in there. That was actually about a 3-year digression, which turned out to be not successful, but it was a super good experience.
Did you have some really difficult times or some really exciting times?
Yeah, no, we had. If I say what are the most difficult times, I remember. The absolute worst time was after I started Gigaterra, this venture capital backed thing. I actually then officially moved over to work 100% at Gigaterra, and I delegated the operational responsibility to my other guys at Time Bandwidth. Anyway, when that started to fall apart, it's a long, long story, but I basically got fired from Gigaterra with no notice, and that turned out that was a strategic mistake by my not so smart investors. But I got fired. They then tried to sell Gigaterra against some IP contracts that we had in place. And then they also threatened me further. And we just had bought a new house. We had 2 young kids, and we just bought a new house. And because the economic downturn, we couldn't sell our other. It was an apartment. So we actually had 2 houses and very high payments. I just lost the one job what I had, which was paying me some money, and then I started to think, man, I could lose everything, right? Both companies, maybe I have to get rid of both homes, and then we're all living on the street, like you start thinking all of the bad things that could happen. And so I had a couple of days where I had the feeling that starting these companies was the worst decision in my entire life, right? So,
how old are you at the time?
So that was like in 2003. So I was 42.
Okay, I'm 44, so I can imagine myself.
Yes,
You've got the job, you've got the family, you've got the mortgage.
Fired from one day to the next, threatened, double mortgage. 2 companies, which, and at that point, by the way, that was after the big telecom downturn, so nobody was doing good from a business point of view, right? The whole thing could have just exploded. So I felt really bad for a couple of days and then started to pull myself together. My wife also supported me through that one, which was for sure a big strain on her. And then I went out and ended up finding one really good lawyer whose first piece of advice was to hire 2 other lawyers. And I had 3 lawyers working for me, and we came up with a strategy and went on a counterattack. And it's a long story, but we ended up winning in the sense that I ended up acquiring the company from the venture capital investors. They had actually not a controlling ownership from percentage, but just from a decision point of view. We ended up spending more money on the lawyers than on acquiring the company. But that's kind of what it took to make that happen. So we acquired all the intellectual property and all the assets, and I rolled it back into Time Bandwidth and kind of kept it alive for another 5 or 10 years, the technology there.
Well, that is an example of course, struggling times. But that's the reality.
Right. And then it turned out, again, this is all the benefit of hindsight. What we thought was going to be a super huge telecom market, which is why we did Gigaterra as a separate company, of course, didn't materialize. That's a long story, but the market and the technology requirements changed. But then what drove Time Bandwidth to ultimately be interesting was this micromachining application, which I'd heard about for many years, and I never thought it was going to be really more than an R&D curiosity. But it turned out then in 2005 and later, it started to become actually a real application for microelectronics, and that's what ultimately. So it's not something I predicted, right? I actually had it on my original business plan back in the late 90s that micromachining was an application, but it was like a tiny little circle, and I had big circles for other things, right? So it turned out that that my applications were wrong. I mean,
But so persistence in the hard times, the persistence, and keep going, and the fighter spirit is what kept you going.
Just
so give us some more a highlight, a really exciting.
Also, on the highlight side, there was I would say as a general comment, right? It always feels good when you build a laser, and a lot of times we made sort of like semi-custom lasers with special features that they just couldn't get from other people. We would build it, and it was often hard and difficult, and you weren't always sure if you could do it. But then we would get it going, and then go to the customer and install it, and they would be happy, and then we would get send them the invoice and get the $50 or $100 or $200,000 payment for this big laser system. That always felt good.
So the satisfaction you need
of seeing the circle, and at the end, there's you still have a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of things that could go wrong, and then you kind of complete the circle. And it sounds very capitalistic, right? But I mean, in the end, the payment, the payment it's like we liked it, we accepted it. Here's the payment. And of course, you're still not off the hook. If the laser fails, you have to fix it under warranty, and there could still be a lot of work you have to do. But normally, we did well on that one. So that was good. I think the other super cool thing, this is going back to Silicon Valley and Photonics West, one of my contacts, which actually came through Lightwave Electronics, was a guy at Intel. His name is Mario Panicia, so maybe he'll see this, right? He ended up becoming like the head of the photonics R&D at Intel many years later, but he was a young engineer, and he approached me first to do some consulting. They were making a measurement system using a mode lock laser from Lightwave, and he needed a little bit of support for some timing issues. And we continued to talk. We actually both liked each other. And he came to me a year or so later with this problem that they wanted to have a high repetition rate laser for optical clocking as an R&D project. And that's what kicked off a whole line of research, and ultimately that led to Gigaterra too, where we asked the question, could we take this core technology and make it work at 10 times or 100 times higher repetition rate? So my answer was, I was an engineer, and I was like, I sort of understand it, but I don't know if we can do that. So I went to Ursi and her group, and Ursi said, okay, we can take a look at that, right? And so we actually got some funding going pretty quickly through Switzerland. And so she ended up, at the time, things ran at 100 megahertz. That was just the standard thing. And I just asked the question, can you push this up into the gigahertz range? And she was like, yeah, why not? Let's go see. And in the end, she demonstrated 160 gigahertz, which is this tiny little laser as opposed to this big thing. And that was kind of, looking back, that was like super cool, right? Now, unfortunately there also, the application didn't take off, right? But Intel supported that for many years, and then ended up even giving her research group funding to continue to develop it in certain aspects. And it led to us going into the Gigaterra, which was a telecom application. Optical clocking of microprocessors, unfortunately, has not yet taken off. It still might. But it was just a super cool technology. And for example, one of our EPIC members, Menhir Photonics, is making gigahertz lasers in this style. So they're taking that know-how, which came out of all of that early work, it was mostly R&D work, and using it now to make a product for a timing style product. So,
since you mentioned Menhir Photonics, Florian Emory, do you think that he's like a new wave of entrepreneurs, a continuation, or how do you see that?
Yeah, and he's actually, I think Ursi also said, he's a student.
Do you see yourself a little bit or not?
Oh, he's different. He's way Frencher than I am. So that's
yes.
that's a fundamental. Americans and French, we just can never quite compare ourselves to each other, right? But he's a super nice guy. It was also clear. I didn't know him very well when he came as a graduate student into Ursi's group. But Ursi was always telling me that Florian's like, oh, he's going to start a company. He's made it clear from the beginning, and he seems like a really good guy and all that stuff, right? So for him, it was somehow clear from the beginning that he wanted to do a startup company in lasers, right? So that was his thing. It was in his.
It's a nice, the story. It continues. You created one, you met Ursi. There's another PhD. Florian goes, and they continue per person.
She has out of her group, and that was one of the double-edged swords, right? She trained some of my best competitors, and out of her group, there's a bunch of startup companies and or competitors. So the people who were the competitors, and it's okay now because I sold the company and it's not my problem, so to speak, right? But But the biggest competitors were, there's Amplitude, which is Clemens Honinger. That was one of our early. I worked with Clemens, right? We trained him. There was HiQ Laser, Daniel Culp. I worked with him. Ursi and I trained him. He was also very aggressive, and they're all smart guys, right? He decided, my attitude there was also, it's like, when they saw that I could do a startup company, they were like, I'm just as smart as that guy. and they were younger and could work even harder. And that was seeing the examples, though. It's like, well, if he can do it, I can do it, right? And that's really true, right? I mean, I don't think I'm...
But I think it's important because if you were the only one, we've got some member companies, and a lot of the companies you mentioned, they're member of Epic. We have some companies like, why is nobody else doing it?
Exactly, yeah.
But indeed, the fact you have many companies, they all give a different touch, I think it also helps maybe to move forward the industry together.
Definitely. I mean, the networking of Epic, of course, is super helpful, I think, in the long run. I'm sure that even helped Florian a lot, too. If he'd just been all by himself in Zurich, it would have been harder for him to do
So we
that.
continue that entrepreneurship, but then in the end, you sold the company.
Right. So of course, I would say if you're honest with yourself, right, some people will say, oh, I don't want to sell it, I want to keep it in the family, right? I would never advise my children to follow in my footsteps. I think that's not particularly healthy. If they really, really wanted to, that's fine, but not as a goal. And so I never was thinking that I would not sell it, but I never really put into place a plan to do it. But every time, I had a chance to talk to somebody who might be a potential acquirer, I certainly kept the doors open. Mm-hmm. And I had at least a number of relatively serious conversations and interactions where, we started to go down the path, and then for various reasons it didn't go further, right? And I was always like, that's okay, So in the case where we sold it, I got a telephone call from, a guy that I'd known in the industry. And he said, this is JDS, and we're looking to partner with somebody who's a leader in ultrafast. And we're sending some people around to look at a couple of companies, and can we come visit you guys? And I was like, what do you say? The answer is yes.
Keep the doors open always.
Right, and so we came, started a conversation. Actually, we came first. We showed up at Photonics West in 2013, and I met with the guy who called me, and the president of the group at the time, Alan Lowe, who's now the CEO of Lumentum, and the business development manager, and those were the guys that ended up driving the deal, of course. And they basically said, we had this relatively quick and efficient discussion where we're like, I'm interested in any kind of strategic thing. What are you thinking? Do you want to give me NRE, or do you want to do a minority investment? And they're like, well, no, if we like you, we're going to acquire you. It's like, okay. It's like you start the process.
So they felt that the timing was okay.
Yeah, it was okay. And they had their own internal process. So what they did is they shopped around for, 3 months or 6 months. They visited me, kept looking around. And I was like, okay, maybe they're going to do something else, whatever. And then they called me up in the summer and said, hey, we want to move on and start real due diligence. Then we start the whole negotiation process. So we really kind of got into it. It was sometime, I think, in the summer or even late summer, where we really got engaged or re-engaged. And then it closed in January, right before Photonics West. So that was a pretty intense experience, to say the least.
Yeah, as I say, you close the cycle again. So I'm assuming you stayed a little bit longer with the company, but now you're no longer with...
I stayed almost 5 years after getting acquired.
5 years? Okay.
Which was surprising to me that I lasted that long. But, it was good.
So now that you're no longer with the company, what do you do?
Well, I sort of took last year as a sabbatical year, is what I like to say. Even though I wasn't super sabbatical, I cleaned up, I did a bunch of personal projects. Then I continued to invest in a lot of smaller ticket investments in startup companies with this group called Invest Here in Zurich, like we were talking about. And that's fun and entertaining. Then I got invited to join the board of another startup in Zurich called Scrona, not in the photonic space, but there's an overlap. So what they do would potentially, for example, have applications in the photonic space or in display technology or micro LED technology. So I know technically enough to sort of maybe see where it could be helpful. And I also know a lot of the customers that they would target would also be customers that we would have targeted with micromachining or did target with micromachining, because the driver of that industry is basically smartphones, right? It's high-performance displays and touch screens and things like that, right? So it's advanced electronics.
Okay, so you keep going. Epic is actively supporting anything that has to do with entrepreneurship and funding and helping companies grow and all of that. So I hope you will see you around. I mean, if you're new, you remain member of Epic.
Yes.
Loyal and engaged.
Individual member, I guess you'd call it, or something, right? Yeah.
But what is valuable for us is your expertise, your knowledge, your perspective. I think we have to help all each other to move the whole industry forward.
Well, and one of my general pitches, and I tell my American friends this a lot, is I think the opportunity of Europe is that right now there's a lot of really excellent technology and even a lot of excellent startup companies, but they tend to be at a relatively small and they're not necessarily thinking very big. And so I think that there is real opportunity to support that system, right?
Do you think that companies should be more ambitious, moving faster?
Yes. I think the simple answer is yes. So I think the California stereotype is the companies are so ambitious that it's overly hyped, and you occasionally get things like the Theranos thing where it's like so super overhyped and then it all implodes. And on the flip side is most Europeans are so pragmatic and careful that they're not willing to step very much out of their comfort zone. And so that just limits their opportunities. And somehow finding the right, mix of that is where I think the potential is. So it's getting easier and easier to scale a company globally. We're all learning how to do that. Many of our Epic members have gone through that themselves. And I think then taking that and applying it to good technologies with really interesting market applications then has great potential.
So let's take the best of all worlds. We have all the technology from Europe. We can take the ambitions from the US. We can learn the speed and agility of China.
The manufacturing expertise. Exactly. That's the way I look at it, right? You take the skill set of each of those major groups and then try to bring it all together. It's still a challenge, but it's definitely possible to do that, right?
Do you think that Europe has a bright future in photonics?
Of course I do, yes. Yeah. But I really do, actually. I think again, and here's a small anecdote, right? When I came here in 1993, the US was definitely considered the leader in lasers and ultrafast, right? That's not true anymore now. So 25 plus years later, the technical leadership in lasers and ultrafasts is actually more in Europe than in the US, and Asia is still catching up, right? But they're catching up pretty fast, but right now they're not really leaders in the new innovative technology, right? So it's guys like Tuneman, all of the Fraunhofers, at least in terms of micromachining, and all of the innovative startup companies have come out of Europe, Femto Laser and Amplitude, and even IPG was actually a European startup, right? It started in Germany and Russia, basically. Now they're headquartered in the US because they're super successful and super big. And again, nobody believed Gapontsev that fiber lasers would be more than 10 or 20 watts, right? I thought it was crazy. Oops, he was right. So a lot of the innovation's been coming out of Europe right now.
So of course I understand companies look at competition and things like that, but from an industry perspective at large, I'm really glad to see innovation moving forward, companies moving forward. I'm just glad to see photonics being deployed into all applications and everything moving forward.
Right. Yeah, there's huge opportunity there actually. So.
Yeah. Anything else you would like to say before we close?
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, Kurt, thank you again
very
much
for
that.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Yeah, that was fun.
Thanks for this open
You're welcome.
discussion.
Thanks for inviting me. Yeah,
it's a pleasure.